So, are you looking at the universe from the creator down or the creation up?
Welcome to this explainer. We're diving into the ultimate theological balancing act. It totally flips how we view existence.
Right. So the source introduces this wild formula, nephi and isbat, first to negate the false, then affirm the truth. Like the phrase, La ilaha illallah, you literally have to clear your mind with no before accepting the yes. Think about the pure logic. Art needs an artist, right? So the universe inherently needs a creator.
Since our minds are totally hardwired for cause and effect, absolute atheism actually becomes a massive logical paradox.
But here's the real question. Is this creator just some distant clockmaker or actively involved right now?
Ayatul Kursi describes an unsleeping, unforgetting God. Without that active presence, the whole cosmos would just collapse into chaos.
The source calls this Tanzih. It's the idea that the creator is completely, entirely beyond our human comprehension.
But watch out. Absolute Tanzih is dangerous. It makes the creator this distant, unreachable entity you can't ever know.
On the flip side, we have Tashbih. This tries to understand God through worldly comparisons and relatable stuff.
But the text warns that extreme Tashbih dangerously shrinks the divine down into human-like forms or physical incarnations.
Because of this, human theology ends up swinging wildly like a pendulum between pure transcendence and pure immanence. To balance this out, the text says, nothing is like him. That totally anchors us in unimaginable awe.
But then it immediately says, every day he is upon some matter. See? Deep, active, everyday involvement.
Bouncing between these concepts is super intentional. It literally stretches your mind and tunes your soul like an instrument.
So how does this cosmic theology actually affect us? Let's bring this massive paradigm right down to earth.
Historically, the Inquisition viewed smiling as a sin. But Islamic tradition, it sees smiling as literal worship.
A famous teaching says, a smile to your brother is charity. Just a simple smile counts as divine charity.
It's a whole spiritual economy of joy. Balancing cosmic awe with everyday human kindness is the ultimate goal.
So, armed with this amazing perspective, how are you going to reflect this divine balance in your life today?
Welcome to the Explainer. So, let's dive right into a truly fascinating topic today. We're going to explore the dynamic and honestly perfectly balanced way our source material describes the attributes of God. It's really a journey into understanding the divine without falling into those common human misconceptions that so often cloud our spiritual vision.
To make sense of all this, we're going to break these concepts down into 5 quick sections. First, how do we know God? Second, the formula of negation and affirmation. Third, God's active presence. Fourth, the balance of transcendence and immanence. And finally, the limits of human language. Let's get started.
All right, section 1. How do we know God? Starting from the creation to the creator.
The source material hits us with a critical point right out of the gate. We always have to look upwards from the creation to the creator, rather than trying to start from the infinite down. And this actually challenges us on a deeply personal level. Do you believe in God 100%? Now, I know it sounds like a simple question, but do we subconsciously divide his attributes? Like, do we go through life acting like otherworldly forces, people, or random circumstances are actually the things controlling our destiny?
Think about the number 50 for a second, because it illustrates a pretty fascinating historical problem. The source points out that historical polytheists didn't actually completely deny God. No, instead, they split him 50-50. They inappropriately took the exclusive powers of the divine and basically handed them out to other things, whether that was nature or statues or human rulers. So the real danger isn't always outright denial, right? More often than not, it's dilution.
Which brings us to our second section, the formula of negation and affirmation, clearing the mind. This method, which is traditionally known as nephi va isbat, is exactly how we fix that percentage problem we just talked about. It's this incredibly active process of clearing your mind of false idols before you can affirm the true God. Think about the duality here. The fundamental statement of Islamic faith, La ilaha illallah, actually starts with a negation, affirm no or law. You literally have to throw the worldly idols and distractions behind you first. Only after you do that do you reach the affirmation, the accept or illah, pulling that singular truth of God into your heart.
And this formula is so foundational, it actually structures entire chapters of Scripture. Take Surah Al-Kafirun, for example. It acts as the ultimate negation. It establishes an absolute, uncompromising no to false worship, which beautifully sets the stage for what comes next. Right after wiping the slate completely clean, we get Surah al-Ikhlas, which acts as the affirmation, the ultimate yes to God's absolute oneness.
Moving right along to Section 3, God's active presence. Focusing on involvement, not just existence. Here's something I find genuinely captivating. The source text actually considers proving God's mere existence to be entirely redundant. And to understand why, just think about a few relatable everyday analogies. A dress requires a tailor, a building requires an architect, a book requires an author. The text argues that the human mind is fundamentally hardwired for cause and effect. Because of this built-in logical coding, absolute atheism is framed as a logical impossibility. We just intuitively know that an effect absolutely demands a cause.
So the crucial point isn't if he exists, but how he interacts with us. The famous Ayatul Kursi describes a God who neither slumbers nor sleeps. And the source notes a really clever piece of human psychology here. Sometimes, deep down, people secretly wish for a distant, sleeping God who conveniently forgets their flaws. But an active, non-sleeping God is strictly necessary. Think about it. If the Creator slept for even a fraction of a moment, the entire cosmos would instantly collapse into total chaos.
And this active presence is emphasized absolutely everywhere. Let me give you a surprising fact. The phrase, "Which of your Lord's favors will you deny?" is repeated 31 times in Surah Ar-Rahman. But the source explains this isn't just some mindless repetition. It's incredibly dynamic. Every single one of those 31 repetitions serves a very precise purpose, to negate the denial of the specific, unique blessing that was mentioned immediately before it.
All right, Section 4, the balance of transcendence and immanence. Tanzih versus Tashbih.
This right here is perhaps the most crucial balancing act in our entire discussion. It's all about avoiding the extreme dangers of making God entirely unknowable on one hand or way too human-like on the other. First up, let's talk about Tanzih. This is absolute transcendence, basically placing God completely outside of creation. But we really have to be careful here. Taking this to the absolute extreme creates a totally unreachable, deistic deity who doesn't interact with the world at all.
Now, flip that over to the exact opposite extreme, and we have Tashbih. This is immanence, which means describing God through physical, worldly forms. The real danger here is that excessive immanence leads to absurd claims of physical incarnation. The source references historical deviations across various traditions where believers are actually told that they too can literally become gods, basically reducing the divine to a mere object.
So think about it like two theological ditches you desperately want to avoid. On one side, extreme Tanzih leaves us with an entirely uninvolved deistic God. On the other side, extreme Tashbih completely reduces God to an anthropomorphic physical form. What the source text does so beautifully is navigate right down the middle between these two extremes. It completely refuses both the distant, uninvolved God and the physically incarnate God, finding this incredibly vibrant spiritual balance.
So how does the scripture actually maintain this balance? Well, listen to this pivotal quote. "Nothing is like him." This is the ultimate statement of Tanzih. It's a profound mental reset. It literally means that whatever image, shape, or concept happens to pop into your limited human mind, you can be absolutely certain that is definitively not God.
But then, right on the heels of that, we get this remarkable counterweight verse. He is actively involved every moment. This acts as the perfectly balanced Tashbih. It reminds us that even though God is unlike anything we can possibly imagine, he isn't just sitting far away up in the clouds. He is intimately, passionately, and actively involved in every single moment of our daily lives.
And that brings us to our fifth and final section, the limits of human language, finding a spiritual smile.
We have to remember something really important here. Scripture is ultimately forced to use finite human language to describe an entirely infinite reality. To brilliantly illustrate where that language hits its limit, the source points out a really subtle distinction. We naturally and intuitively accept that God sees and hears, right? But our souls instinctively reject the idea of God tasting or smelling. Why is that? Well, because seeing and hearing don't strictly require biological organs in a metaphysical sense. But tasting and smelling, those actions imply a physical dependency. They imply a biological need and a deficiency. And our intuition just naturally knows that the infinite lacks absolutely nothing.
Because of this linguistic limitation, language is often designed to neutralize our human ego. Take this incredibly beautiful verse. You threw not when you threw, but Allah threw. It's a profound reminder that while we absolutely have to make the effort, believers must acknowledge the divine hand in all of their worldly successes.
It teaches us that the ultimate force behind our achievements is not just our own ability.
There's this beautiful historical quote that perfectly sums this up. The mind is a scale that cannot weigh an infinite mountain. True comprehension of God isn't about solving some complex mathematical equation. It is about humbly recognizing our absolute inability to fully box him in with our small, limited human minds.
Now, I want to inject a really warm, kind of surprising note here before we wrap up. While certain medieval religious traditions actually considered laughing to be a sin, the Islamic tradition highlighted in our source material takes the exact opposite approach. It considers a simple, genuine smile to be an act of charity. It reflects God's grace. Just think about that for a second. A smile is literally an act of worship.
Which leaves us with one final provocative question to chew on today. Are you limiting the infinite God to the small scale of your own mind? Are you truly embracing this perfect, dynamic balance of an active, unmatched creator? Or are you subconsciously shrinking the divine to comfortably fit inside your human limitations? I really want you to think deeply about that. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope it brought some incredible clarity to these deep concepts. Keep learning and keep asking those big questions.
If you really think about it, we all harbor this bizarre, almost embarrassing secret desire when it comes to the universe. We secretly want a creator who, suffers from occasional, highly selective amnesia.
Yeah, we want a God who forgets, which is, wild.
Right. Just let that sink in for a second.
Yeah.
We look up at the cosmos, at this unfathomable machinery of existence, and part of us hopes that whoever or whatever is running the show just happens to have memory lapses when it comes to our own personal mistakes.
It's a profound psychological paradox. I mean, we demand this omnipotent, flawless reality to keep the planet spinning and gravity working.
Yeah, we want the physics to work.
Exactly. But we want a deeply flawed, human-like forgetfulness applied exclusively to our own ledgers.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today's mission is to explore how we humans conceptualize the divine, the absolute limits of the language we use, and how ancient philosophical concepts actually dictate the way we live, the way we judge each other, and even the way we smile.
We're unpacking a highly complex framework of Islamic theology today.
And just to be crystal clear right at the start, our goal is not to endorse these theological viewpoints or, take a religious stance. Our role is to impartially explore the fascinating philosophical, historical, and sociological ideas presented in this source material. We're going to look at how belief systems attempt to define the undefinable.
And to really understand that framework, we have to start with the mechanics of how this specific theology defines God. We're moving from high-level metaphysics down to practical human behavior.
Which is quite the journey.
It is. But before we can understand what God is, we have to grasp a rhetorical method that starts entirely with what God is not. This is the concept of negation and affirmation.
Right. The Arabic terms Nephi, which means negation, and isbat, which is affirmation. This is like the foundational method of defining the divine in this tradition. You absolutely must negate before you can affirm.
It's the structure of the fundamental declaration of faith. La ilaha illallah. First, you have the absolute no, saying there is no deity.
Right. Then the ilay, the except or only except Allah. You cannot establish the truth without first entirely wiping away all false conceptualizations.
The psychology behind needing to negate first is fascinating. Because humans, we naturally want to accumulate. We want to add things together. But this theological approach demands subtraction. It demands a complete clearing of the board.
The analogy that constantly comes to my mind when thinking about this is trying to work at a cluttered desk.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, imagine you have this one vital, irreplaceable document. It's the most important thing in your life. If you just toss it onto a desk covered in junk mail, half-empty coffee cups, old receipts, and tangled charging cables, that document gets completely lost in the mess.
Right, it loses its prominence.
Exactly. It just becomes another piece of paper in the chaos. So to give that document the respect and focus it actually requires, you have to take your arm and physically sweep everything off the desk into the trash. That total clearing of the space is the negation.
And only then, on a completely bare, clean surface, do you set down that single document, which is the affirmation.
Spot on.
And that analogy maps perfectly onto the historical critique of polytheism within this framework. There's this common misconception that polytheists throughout history actively denied the existence of a creator God.
Wait, they didn't?
Not exactly. The framework suggests their primary error wasn't denial, it was sharing. They didn't sweep the desk clean. They believed in a creator, sure, but they just added that creator to the pile of other idols, nature spirits, or, abstract concepts.
Oh, I see. So they effectively believed in a 50% God or an 80% God, depending on how much space the other deities took up.
Precisely. They took the absolute attributes of the divine-like power, providence, ultimate authority, and they distributed them. The theological goal presented here is the 100% God.
And achieving a 100% God requires absolute negation of everything else. There can be zero sharing of divine attributes.
Which is interesting because this abstract philosophical idea actually translates into a highly physical daily ritual. Think about the specific body language used at the very beginning of the formal Islamic prayer.
Right. The worshiper raises their hands up to their ears, palms facing forward. The symbolism there is incredibly vivid.
It really is. That motion of raising the hands with palms out is symbolically pushing the world away. It is throwing the universe, the clutter of the desk, your daily anxieties, your ego behind your back.
That a physical motion is the law, the negation.
You're taking everything that is not the 100% God and physically discarding it from your immediate focus.
Then immediately after throwing the world behind you, you fold your hands over your chest. That is the Elia, the affirmation. You're clasping the divine truth, the hereafter, to your chest.
It shows the theology isn't just something you think about, it's something your body physically enacts multiple times a day. You have to enact the negation before you can embrace the affirmation.
Which brings us back to that provocative idea of the forgetting God from the intro. Once you establish this 100% God, you're dealing with an entity that is absolute in every capacity, including vigilance.
Right. There's a famous Quranic verse, Ayatul Kursi, which is recited constantly to serve as a reminder of a God who neither slumbers nor sleeps.
And this is where the human hypocrisy becomes so glaring, honestly. We are so comforted by the idea of an all-seeing God when it comes to maintaining the laws of physics. We like up that gravity doesn't take a day off.
Oh, absolutely.
But when it applies to our own moral failings, we suddenly want a deity with blind spots. We want God to forget our mistakes, our cruelties, our moments of selfishness.
But apply that same standard to the people who have wronged us. If someone betrays you or hurts your family, you don't want God to have amnesia about that. You demand absolute, unyielding, photographic justice for your enemies.
We want total forgetful mercy for ourselves and inescapable vigilance for everyone else. It's so selfish.
It is. If the universe actually operated on the exact desires of the human ego if it were governed by a God who sleeps, a God who forgets, a God who operates with our level of selfish inconsistency, the cosmos would instantly collapse into chaos.
Because the order of existence relies entirely on a 100% God whose vigilance is absolute. If the fundamental laws of reality had moments of forgetfulness, existence itself would unravel.
Exactly. The constant reminder of a non-sleeping God is a reality check against our own chaotic, self-serving nature.
So establishing this overwhelming absolute creator naturally leads to a massive question. If this 100% God is the foundational reality of everything, why does the Quran spend so little time actually trying to prove that God exists? The text seems to completely bypass the basic philosophical debate of existence.
It bypasses it because within this framework, attempting to prove the existence of God is viewed as fundamentally illogical. It's almost treated as an insult to basic human reasoning.
Really? An insult?
Yeah. The premise here is that absolute atheism, a pure 100% absence of belief in a creator, is essentially a tautological impossibility.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of that claim. Why is it framed as an impossibility?
It hinges entirely on how the human mind is hardwired. Our intellect is inextricably coded for cause and effect relationships. We literally cannot perceive reality without automatically assuming causality.
Like if you walk onto a beach and see a perfectly formed footprint in the sand, your brain does not allow you to conclude that the wind and the waves randomly arranged the sand into the shape of a foot. You instantly, involuntarily know that a person walked there.
Right. An effect implies a cause. And the mundane analogies used to illustrate this are really sticky. If you see a beautiful painting, you know an artist exists. If you see a tailored suit, you know a tailor exists.
You don't look at a towering, structurally sound skyscraper and assume the steel beams and glass panels naturally aggregated over millions of years to form a building. You know an engineer and an architect designed it.
The argument basically scales those mundane examples up to the macroscopic level. If we can't accept that a simple pair of shoes exists without a shoemaker, the framework argues it is equivalent to intellectual madness to look at the grand architecture of the universe. galaxies suspended in a vacuum, orbital mechanics functioning in perfect harmony, the staggering complexity of cellular biology, and conclude that it lacks an architect.
The human brain's strict reliance on cause and effect makes a causeless universe fundamentally incompatible with our own cognitive hardware.
Exactly.
Okay, but I have to push back here because there is a very specific, thorny philosophical argument made in the sources about the nature of nothingness.
Oh, right. The naming argument.
Yeah, the claim is that saying God doesn't exist is a logical fallacy because nothing cannot have a name. The non-existent has no name. That feels like a riddle to me. If I say a square circle doesn't exist, I've just named something that doesn't exist. How does this argument actually function?
To understand that, we have to dive into epistemology, how we categorize existence itself. This framework breaks existence down into 3 distinct states.
Okay.
The first is true, physical existence. The chair you're sitting on, the sound waves carrying our voices, they exist in objective, measurable reality.
Tangible, empirical reality.
Right. The second state is mental existence. This is the realm of concepts. Even if every physical chair in the world were suddenly destroyed, the idea of a chair still exists perfectly intact within the human intellect.
That makes sense.
And the third state is linguistic existence. The word chair, the specific arrangement of letters, and the sound they make when spoken.
So applying these 3 states to something imaginary like a ghost.
If someone confidently states, ghosts do not exist, they are accurately stating that ghosts lack the first state, physical existence. However, the very fact that we possess a word for ghost, and that when the word is spoken, a specific conceptual image forms in the minds of both the speaker and the listener, means that the ghost does possess mental and linguistic existence.
Oh, wow. It has a shape in the conceptual realm.
Yes.
I see where this is going. By this logic, absolute nothingness is a void so complete it cannot even be conceptualized. The moment you give something a name, the moment it can be discussed and debated, it has already breached the threshold of absolute nothingness.
It possesses conceptual reality. Therefore, stating God does not exist contains a linguistic and mental contradiction. By naming the divine in order to deny it, you're actively interacting with its conceptual reality.
That is mind-bending. And because this theological framework operates on the assumption that the Creator's existence is a self-evident requirement of human logic, it completely skips the debate over whether God exists. It treats that as a solved equation.
Instead, it moves directly to a much heavier, much more uncomfortable question.
The question of intervention. The real issue isn't whether God is out there in the cosmos, it's whether God is actually involved in your daily life.
The crisis of human existence is framed not as a metaphysical mystery, but as a relational breakdown. God is posited as always active, always present, and deeply invested. The divine love for humanity is treated as an unchanging constant.
So the variable in the equation is the human being.
Precisely.
There's a chilling way this is posed to the listener in the material. The problem isn't whether God loves you or whether God desires good for you. The piercing question is, do you desire good for yourself?
It completely shifts the burden. It stops being a safe, abstract, intellectual debate about the origins of the universe, which, you can hold at arm's length. It becomes a deeply intimate interrogation of your own will and your own actions.
Are you living in a way that aligns with the good that the divine intends for you, or are you actively self-sabotaging?
Right. But introducing this level of extreme intimacy, a creator who is deeply personally involved in the minute, mundane details of human life, creates a massive philosophical tightrope.
Yeah, how do you describe a God who is close enough to care about your daily choices without accidentally reducing him to just a really powerful, invisible human being?
That is the ultimate tension in monotheism. To understand how this tightrope is walked, we have to look at 2 opposing poles of theological thought, Tanzih and Tashbih.
Let's clearly define those extremes. What is the pole of Tanzih?
Tanzih means transcendence. It's the absolute purification of the divine concept. It defines God as completely outside of creation, utterly untouched by time, space, matter, or physical reality.
It's the ultimate untouchable other.
Exactly. Nothing in the physical universe can even approximate God.
And the opposite pole is Tashbih.
Tashbih means immanence, or anthropomorphism. This is the human act of describing God by comparing him to created things. It brings God into the physical universe. It assigns God human emotions, physical weight, a location in space, a body.
Falling too far toward either extreme is viewed as a total disaster in this framework. Let's look at absolute Tanzih pure transcendence. If God is completely distant, entirely unknowable, and totally abstract, it creates a massive psychological void for the believer.
You cannot love a void.
Right. You cannot have a deeply personal relationship with a mathematical absolute that exists outside of time.
Historical examples illustrate the danger of this extreme distance perfectly. Look at the ancient Yahweh tradition. The concept of God became so utterly transcendent, so dangerously distant, and the very name of God became so unutterably sacred that it could barely be spoken.
A vacuum opened up.
And human nature abhors a vacuum. When the divine becomes too far away to interact with, the focus naturally shifts downward. The chosen community, the people themselves, effectively replace the immediate divine presence as the center of the daily religious consciousness.
But the danger of swinging to the other extreme absolute Tashbih, making God too relatable, too physically present, is portrayed as infinitely more chaotic. When humans desperately try to pull God down to a relatable level, the boundary between the creator and the created completely dissolves.
This is where you get the concepts of incarnation and union, the idea that the divine can inhabit a human body.
The human psyche has a relentless gravitational pull toward incarnation. We want a God we can see, touch, and understand. But when that theological boundary is breached, the results are explosive.
History is literally littered with examples of what happens when humans start claiming that the divine has entered into physical form.
The historical examples mentioned in the sources are wild. The founders of the Druze and Nusari faiths are cited as movements that absorbed the belief that the divine had incarnated in human leaders.
Yeah, and you have Mansur al-Hallaj, the famous mystic who proclaimed, "I am the truth," which many interpreted as a direct claim to divinity, blurring that line to the point of execution.
The progression of this phenomenon is fascinating, especially in more modern figures like Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, the founder of the Qadiani movement. You can actually trace the escalation.
Oh, absolutely. He didn't start by claiming to be God. He started by claiming to be the Mahdi, a guided human leader.
Great. And when his followers accepted that, the boundary pushed further, and he claimed to be the promised Messiah. Then, pushing the boundary until it broke entirely, he claimed prophethood.
It's the insatiable nature of the human ego when it gets mixed with theology. If someone convinces themselves they possess a sliver of the divine, there is no logical stopping point.
One of the most stark, almost brutal illustrations of this is the story regarding Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith.
The imagery used there is so visceral. Baha'u'llah reportedly went out into the Kavir Desert in Iran at a young age, subjecting himself to 60 degrees Celsius heat, which is around 140 degrees Fahrenheit.
That's insane.
The commentary brutally suggests that waiting in that kind of unimaginable heat literally melts the brain, leading to the hallucination that one is a divine manifestation.
It's a vivid illustration of the intellectual and spiritual collapse that occurs when humans try to force the infinite into a biological vessel.
And this desire for union even extends into interpretations of Buddhism, specifically regarding the concept of Krishna, where the suggestion is that anyone, through enough effort, can achieve a state of divinity.
It democratizes God to a dangerous degree. Because if anyone can become a god, then being a god means nothing. It leads to the absolute extreme where philosophers begin claiming they see the divine essence literally residing in animal waste.
Because if God is everything, and everything is God, then God is the dirt. The transcendence is entirely destroyed.
So the crucial question becomes, how do you survive this tightrope? How do you avoid the freezing, lonely void of absolute transcendence and the chaotic, ego-driven absurdity of absolute immanence?
The answer is a forced, perpetual state of tension. The theology demands that the believer constantly balance the two concepts, using two specific Quranic phrases to keep the mind in check.
To maintain Tanzih transcendence, it uses the phrase, "nothing is like him." This pushes God infinitely far away. But instantly, to prevent God from becoming an unreachable abstraction, it yanks the concept back with Tashbih immanence, using the phrase, "he's at work every single day."
This creates a deliberate, exhausting psychological state. The human soul is strung out like a tightrope walker between these two opposing poles. Imagine a massive pendulum.
Okay.
On the far left side of the swing is the thought. God is completely unknowable, entirely beyond all human thought and physics. The pendulum swings to the far right. God is intimately right here, intimately aware of the exact angle of the leaf falling from the tree outside my window, actively intervening in my life right this second.
You are required to constantly swing between them. You are never allowed to rest.
Because resting is dangerous. If you stop the pendulum on the left, you lose your connection and fall into apathy. If you stop the pendulum on the right, you lose your reverence, you risk turning God into a superhero, and you fall into arrogance.
The exhaustion of the constant swing is the entire point. It's a mechanism designed to constantly remind you of the severe limits of your own mind. Which perfectly transitions us into the problem of language itself, because language is the tool we use to think. If God is like nothing else, as the pendulum swing demands, how can we possibly use human words to talk about him?
Every single word in every human language is based entirely on comparing things to other things within our physical universe.
Right.
This is the concept of mutashabih, which translates to metaphorical or allegorical. It is a vital, pragmatic recognition. The text may be considered the word of God, but Arabic, English, Mandarin, they're all human languages. They're spoken by mortal, flawed beings bound by space and time.
Therefore, anytime a human language attempts to describe the divine, it is inherently, fundamentally metaphorical. It cannot ever be literal.
A deep dive into the specific Arabic word used in that phrase, nothing is like him, reveals the absolute finality of this. The word used for like is misul.
Arabic is a highly precise language, and there are many words for similarity. Nid means an equal or a peer. Shikl implies a resemblance in inner quality or nature. Musalla implies a resemblance in number or outward appearance.
But misul encompasses every single one of those categories simultaneously. It means identical in inner quality, outer appearance, quantity, and fundamental nature. It is a total one-to-one clone.
So when the theology states nothing is his misalio, it is a comprehensive, absolute denial of any possible point of comparison.
A brilliant way to summarize this is, whatever comes to your mind, that is not God.
Wow.
The very act of your physical brain being able to conjure an image or a concept instantly disqualifies that concept from being the ultimate divine reality.
But this creates a practical problem. The text does use sensory words to describe God. It constantly says God hears and God sees. If nothing is like him, isn't saying he hears an anthropomorphism. Isn't that assigning him human ears and an auditory cortex?
This is where a fascinating logical filter is applied to the language. Notice that while the text uses words like hearing and seeing for God, it never uses words like smelling or tasting.
I never noticed that.
There's a profound, airtight metaphysical reason for this distinction. Seeing and hearing in their most abstract forms are faculties of pure awareness. They don't inherently require a physical organ to conceptualize. You can imagine an omniscient awareness observing the universe without needing physical eyeballs.
But smelling, and particularly tasting, are inherently, inescapably linked to physical consumption.
Exactly. To taste an apple, you must bite the apple. You must ingest it. Ingestion implies that you have a physical body that requires calories to function. Needing calories implies hunger.
And hunger implies a deficiency, a vulnerability, a dependency on the physical universe to sustain your existence.
If you say God tastes, you're inadvertently saying God is dependent on the universe for survival. If the creator is dependent on the creation, the entire concept of the 100% God shatters.
Therefore, the language selectively uses metaphors that imply total awareness while strictly forbidding any metaphor that implies physical dependency. The human spirit intuitively accepts an all-seeing entity, but the moment you introduce the concept of a tasting God, the mind recoils because it recognizes the inherent physical limitation.
This incredibly careful navigation of human language reaches its absolute peak in a verse from Surah An-Anfal, which encapsulates the entire paradox of the human-divine relationship in a single, mind-bending sentence.
It refers to a battle, right?
Yes, and it reads, "When you threw, you did not throw, but Allah threw."
It is a deliberate, beautiful contradiction. It begins by fully acknowledging the physical reality of human free will and action. When you threw, it does not deny that the human being made the choice, picked up the projectile, engaged their muscles, and hurled it.
But immediately, it subverts the ownership of that action. You did not throw. And finally, it attributes the ultimate realization of the act to the divine. But Allah threw.
The practical impact of this paradox on a person's mindset is massive. Think about an archer hitting a bullseye. A believer operating under this framework never says, I hit the target purely by my own supreme skill and power.
Right. Because you don't control the wind current.
Exactly. Yes, you practiced. Yes, you drew the bow, but you don't control the atomic structure of the target. You do not maintain the laws of physics that allow the arrow to fly straight. If the arrow finds the target, it is because the ultimate cause, the divine, allowed the complex chain of causality to succeed.
Attributing ultimate sovereign success entirely to your own ego is a metaphysical lie. It is the ultimate antidote to human arrogance. You must act, you must strive, you must take total responsibility for your choices when you threw, but you must remain deeply, existentially humble about the outcome.
Unfortunately, while human language can sometimes struggle beautifully with these profound concepts, human nature often fails entirely. Living in that state of tension, swinging on that pendulum, is hard. People want shortcuts. When they couldn't rely on pure, tension-filled metaphysical truths, they started inventing things.
Which leads us to a highly controversial historical phenomenon: the fabrication of texts, specifically fake hadiths. Hadiths are the reported sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, and they form a massive foundational part of Islamic tradition and law.
But over the centuries, a dangerous trend emerged where people started slapping the Prophet's name onto complex philosophical ideas that he never actually uttered.
Two very famous, widely circulated phrases are completely dismantled here. Many people deeply believe these are core Islamic hadiths. The first is, "I was a hidden treasure and I wanted to be known, so I created the universe."
And the second is addressed directly to the Prophet. If not for you, I would not have created the universe.
The textual analysis applied to these phrases is ruthless. They are classified as entirely fabricated. They have absolutely zero backing in rigorous, authentic hadith methodology. They are not found in any of the primary verifiable historical collections.
This raises a really important sociological question, though. Why would brilliant scholars, specifically mystical philosophers like Ibn Arabi, who are heavily associated with propagating these ideas, invent or use these forged sayings? Why forge a historical quote?
To understand that, you have to understand the specific sociology of the ancient Arab oral tradition. This was a culture that venerated ancestors and deeply worshipped the authority of the past.
Knowledge wasn't validated by peer review. It was validated by the isnad, the chain of transmission. I heard from my teacher, who heard from his teacher, who heard from the companion.
Exactly. In a society structured like that, the sheer logical merit of an idea doesn't matter if it doesn't have a pedigree. If a brilliant philosopher like Ibn Arabi developed a genuinely profound, complex metaphysical theory about the origin of the universe, like the idea of God as a hidden treasure-seeking manifestation, he faced a wall.
If he just stood up and said, "I had a brilliant philosophical breakthrough," the culture would reject him. They would say, "Who are you to have a new thought? Where is your chain of authority?"
So a tragic compromise occurred. To get the masses to listen to brilliant metaphysics, thinkers essentially forged a historical signature.
They took a profound philosophical concept, and to get it published in the minds of the people, they put the prophet's signature at the bottom of the page. They weaponized the culture's obsession with the isnad against itself.
The idea of God as a hidden treasure is acknowledged as a beautiful, poetic piece of metaphysics. The objection isn't to the poetry. The objection is to the historical lie of claiming it is a direct quote from a prophet.
But the second fabricated quote, "If not for you, I would not have created the universe," is treated with absolute zero tolerance. This isn't just a historical forgery. It's viewed as a severe structural theological danger.
Because it completely violates the foundational rule we established in the very beginning, 100% at God.
Right.
If you claim that God created the entire cosmos because of one single human being, even a deeply revered prophet, you are forcing God into a state of determinism and extreme need.
It implies that the creator of the universe, an entity that by definition requires absolutely nothing to exist, somehow needed a human being to justify the act of creation. It makes the infinite fundamentally dependent on the finite.
The critique here is piercing. Does this honor the prophet? Does it elevate him? No, it slanders God. It highlights the danger of unchecked devotional exaggeration.
Uneducated speakers often use this phrase from a pulpit, thinking they are expressing immense love for a religious figure, entirely unaware that they are structurally dismantling the core theological concept of divine independence. A poetic exaggeration, when taken literally, can rot the foundation of an entire belief system.
And this manipulation of texts and traditions didn't just happen with high-level abstract metaphysics. As we pivot to the next area, we see how this exact same process of absorbing and adapting ancient tradition applied to heavy, life-altering, real-world issues. Specifically, criminal law and physical punishment.
This is perhaps the most paradigm-shifting detail we will explore. We are moving from the abstract cosmos down to the brutal reality of criminal justice. The focus is the infamous punishment of amputating a thief's hand.
Most people, both inside and outside the Islamic world, assume this is a uniquely Quranic invention, a harsh, new, divine mandate handed down to regulate society.
But the historical reality presented here is shocking. The Quran did not invent the punishment of cutting off a hand for theft. It was a pre-existing, established legal tradition of the Quraysh, the dominant tribe in Mecca, operating long before the revelation of the text. It was a local, tribal custom.
To explain how a brutal tribal custom ends up codified in a religious text, we have to look at the legal philosophy of early Islamic scholars, particularly Immanence. He argued that when the text absorbs a pre-existing cultural law, rather than inventing a new one from a blank slate, the ultimate divine goal is not the blind, rigid, literal application of that specific physical act.
The goal is the spirit and intent of the law within its specific historical context.
And what was the intent? To deter crime. But the framework builds an immense, nearly impenetrable wall of caveats and loopholes around the actual application of this punishment. It is as if the legal system is actively, desperately trying to find reasons not to carry it out.
The conditions required to actually amputate a hand are staggering. You cannot apply the punishment if the person stole out of need or hunger. You cannot apply it if the stolen item is below a certain significant value. You cannot apply it if the item was food.
You cannot apply it if the item was left out in the open or unsecured. You cannot apply it if the item wasn't secured behind a locked door or in a safe.
These aren't just minor legal technicalities. They act as a massive ethical shield designed to protect the vulnerable and place the burden of responsibility heavily on society. And there's an incredibly powerful historical anecdote that perfectly illustrates the ethical core of this legal philosophy.
It involves a situation where members of a very powerful, influential tribe brought a thief before the prophet. The thief had been caught red-handed. Technically, purely on paper, all the legal boxes were checked. The punishment could legally be applied.
But the context is everything. This powerful tribe wasn't seeking justice. They were essentially trying to force the prophet's hand. They were using the rigid, literal letter of the law to corrupt the ethical process, likely to demonstrate their own dominance, exact vengeance, or trap the leadership in a political corner under the guise of extreme piety.
The reaction is profound. The prophet looked at the accusers and physically turned pale with anger. And while the punishment was technically applicable on paper, he completely bypassed the thief. He turned his attention entirely to the accusers, the wealthy, powerful men who had eagerly dragged a human being in to be maimed, and he called them the soldiers of Satan.
Soldiers of Satan? He completely flips the script. He identifies the true, insidious evil in the room not as the theft of property, but as the sadistic eagerness to inflict irreversible bodily harm upon another human being while hiding behind the self-righteous veneer of the law.
This specific incident perfectly encapsulates the underlying legal philosophy known as Ijri al-Hudud. This principle dictates that the ultimate goal of the justice system is to drop these severe, irreversible punishments at the absolute slightest hint of doubt.
Why the extreme burden of proof? Because of the concept of reversibility. If a justice system imprisons a person for a crime and 10 years later DNA evidence proves they were innocent, the system can release them. It can offer financial compensation. It can attempt to apologize. The state can reverse the action.
But if a justice system amputates a hand and later realizes there was a mistake or coercion or hidden context, a limb cannot be reattached. A severed hand is a permanent, irreversible act of state violence.
Therefore, the presence of even a microscopic fraction of doubt, or even unethical motivation on the part of the accusers, must completely shatter the application of the law.
It's a profound argument against literalist, context-blind applications of ancient texts. It portrays a system that absorbed a brutal historical reality, but wrapped it in so much ethical red tape that the overriding spirit of mercy was clearly intended to paralyze the letter of the punishment.
We've been talking about incredibly heavy things. The unfathomable majesty of 100% God, the existential tightrope of transcendence, the terrifying weight of irreversible legal punishments. It's dense and it's heavy.
It really is.
If faith is entirely about strict laws, endless caveats, and metaphysical tension, where does human joy actually fit in? Can you even laugh in a universe governed by this kind of theology?
It's a vital question, and the framework provides a deeply surprising answer, transitioning into what we might call the theology of a smile. But to appreciate it, we have to look at the historical context of how religion has often viewed humor.
The historical Western perspective on laughter is notoriously grim. During the Middle Ages, the Inquisition famously banned Aristotle's writings on comedy and laughter.
Early Alexandrian church fathers literally viewed laughter as a cursed sin. The pervasive idea was that perpetual seriousness and almost crushing grim solemnity was the ultimate, visible sign of piety. To laugh was to lose control. It was to succumb to worldly distraction, to let your guard down against sin. Joy was viewed as inherently unholy.
But this framework contrasts that bleak historical view with a deeply embedded Islamic tradition. The concept that a simple smile directed at another human being is legally and spiritually classified as sadaqah. It is an act of charity.
The psychology behind classifying a smile as charity is beautiful. If I walk up to a comfortable middle-class person on the street and hand them a $5 bill, they're going to be deeply insulted.
They aren't poor. They don't need my financial charity, and offering it implies they are beneath me.
But emotional poverty is universal. Everyone, regardless of their bank account, their status, or their power, experiences moments of profound emotional depletion. Everyone is, at some point, in need of a smile.
It's a universal currency of goodwill. It is an aesthetic charity. It costs the giver absolutely nothing to produce, yet it deposits genuine, measurable value into the emotional ledger of the receiver.
This concept isn't just about individual interactions, though. It scales up to a passionate critique of modern culture. The discussion highlights a contemporary anecdote about a Muslim humor and satire magazine called Kaf.
The existence of this magazine is used to launch a severe cultural critique. The argument is that the modern Muslim world is suffering from a devastating aesthetic poverty and an artistic poverty.
They have access to these deep, beautiful theological concepts, like the idea that joy is an act of worship, that a smile is charity, but they fail to produce art, humor, literature, or culture that actually reflects it.
The tragedy of it is painted so vividly. It's like a community sitting directly on top of a massive, pure well of cultural and spiritual value. But they are dying of thirst because they've forgotten how to draw the water. They've become so hyper-focused on the grim, serious, political, and defensive aspects of their identity that they have allowed their artistic and joyful muscles to completely atrophy.
And the warning given is stark. If believers do not actively support their own humor, their own art, their own satirical magazines like Kaf, they are entirely abandoning the cultural narrative.
If you refuse to participate in the creation of joy and intelligent satire, you leave the battlefield entirely open to those who will use humor purely as a weapon to mock you. You forfeit your voice in the culture.
This entire defense of joy is grounded in a single, incredibly powerful Quranic concept. It is He who makes laugh and makes weep.
By attributing the very physiological and psychological capacity for laughter directly to the divine creator, the theology completely removes the historical stigma of humor. It elevates a joke, a piece of sharp satire, a genuine moment of shared joy, from a mere worldly distraction into an act of acknowledging the full spectrum of the human experience as designed by God. Laughter is transformed into a literal act of worship.
It is a remarkable, expansive synthesis. We have traveled from the absolute, unyielding negation of false gods all the way down to the theological defense of a satirical magazine.
We have covered an unbelievable amount of ground today. We started by clearing the cluttered desk with negation and affirmation, wiping away the 50% gods to reveal the absolute 100% God. We explored the deeply human paradox of the forgetting God and realized that a universe built on our own selfish desires for leniency would instantly collapse into chaos.
We examined the hardwiring of the human brain for cause and effect, and how naming nothingness inadvertently gives it a conceptual reality. We walked the treacherous, exhausting theological tightrope between the cold, lonely void of total transcendence and the chaotic, ego-driven absurdity of immanence, where humans melt their brains in the desert trying to claim divinity.
We looked at the inherent structural flaws of human language, understanding why a God who tastes implies a physical deficiency that a God who sees does not. We uncovered the historical tragedy of fake hadiths, driven by an ancient culture desperate for chains of authority, and saw how a simple poetic exaggeration can rot the core of a theology.
We saw the intense, merciful, ethical red tape woven into ancient tribal punishments, turning the bloodthirsty accusers into the soldiers of Satan. And finally, we ended on the profound, aesthetic charity of a simple smile.
It's just so much to process.
We've spent this entire deep dive talking about the massive scale of these concepts. We've wrestled with the absolute limits of human language and the persistent danger of trying to trap the infinite divine in our small, fragile human concepts, whether that's through rigid literalism, fabricated historical chains, or extreme theological swings. But I want to leave you with this final thought. If language ultimately fails to perfectly describe the 100% God, and if our human systems of law and justice are forever prone to bias and error, Perhaps the truest, most accurate reflection of understanding the divine isn't found in constructing a flawless, complex theological argument.
Oh, okay.
Right? It's found in the simplest, most wordless act we discussed today. The next time you smile at a stranger on the street, ask yourself, are you just firing neurons and moving muscles in your face, or are you actually transmitting a microscopic fraction of the divine's profound, quiet mercy into an otherwise chaotic world?
That reframes exactly how we interact with everyone around us. You might not have the clean, sharp, white line of a medical x-ray when dealing with the human soul, but you do have a way forward. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.
This submitted material explores the Islamic theological framework of conceptualizing God, focusing on the delicate balance between negation and affirmation, and transcending extreme interpretations.
Right.
And, we're diving right in today because while it has profound philosophical depth, there are some really specific opportunities for refinement in its structure, its focus, and its pacing.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting into this one. The intellectual ambition here is it's staggering. But with a few targeted adjustments, the impact of these ideas is going to be incredibly powerful.
Exactly. So let's start by looking at how the author sets up the foundational rules for the audience. The material does a phenomenal job mapping out the concepts of nefi wa ispat, which is this idea of negation and affirmation. It makes a highly compelling case for how the human intellect has to, first clear the slate entirely with a definitive no before it can ever arrive at a yes.
It really is a fascinating cognitive mechanism because you aren't just starting with a declaration of faith. You are actively dismantling false, limited concepts of the divine in the reader's mind first.
Right.
And the text uses that mechanism to guide us onto this razor-thin wire between two massive theological poles. So you have Tanzih, which is absolute transcendence.
The terrifyingly vast idea that God is completely beyond human comprehension.
Exactly. And on the other side, you have Tashbih, which is immanence, or, the human attempt to understand the divine through relatable, recognizable attributes.
And as a reader, you feel that tension. You really feel the intense gravity of trying to hold both of those immense concepts in your head at the same time.
You really do.
But right when we are deep in this incredibly abstract metaphysical headspace, the text does something, it's jarring. It feels like we are ascending a highly abstract metaphysical mountain, but then we are suddenly, almost violently, teleported to a modern-day newsstand.
Yeah, that pivot it's intense.
Right? The author just jumps directly from this dense theological dialectic into a promotion of an Islamic humor magazine called Kaf. And then, right after that, jumps into a historical anecdote about the scholar Abu Hayyan al-Tawhidi burning all of his books in a fit of despair.
It is an incredibly sudden drop in altitude.
It is. But, I want to push back a little and defend the author's instinct here. I can see exactly what they are attempting to do.
Sure, the practical anchor.
Yeah, because high-level philosophy can get dry and disconnected if you aren't careful. So the author clearly wants to provide a practical, modern anchor so the audience doesn't just float away.
Right.
They explicitly mention how smiling is considered an act of charity, or sadaqah, and contrast that with the Inquisition's extreme ban on laughter. Doesn't that stark contrast serve as a good enough bridge to ground these lofty ideas? How can they better marry these two distinct tones?
Well, look, the lecture presents a brilliant juxtaposition of dense theology and practical morality, but the transitions between these realms often obscure the overarching thesis.
Okay, how so? Where exactly does the bridge break down for you?
The weakness is that the shift from the profound metaphysical balancing of God's attributes directly into a tangential defense of an Islamic humor magazine feels disjointed.
Right, it's just too sudden.
Exactly. While the author attempts to connect this by discussing humor as an act of worship versus the Inquisition's ban on laughter, the underlying theological tissue connecting it to Tanzih and Tashbih is left completely unarticulated.
So it feels detached.
Completely, making the humor segment feel like an unrelated advertisement spliced into the middle of a lecture.
I see what you mean. The reader is basically doing all the heavy lifting to figure out why we are suddenly talking about
a magazine subscription.
Yeah, you cannot rely on the audience to build the thematic bridge. The material has to construct it for them.
Makes sense.
So my suggestion is to use the core theological principle of balance as the explicit anchor for the practical modern examples, weaving the metaphysical directly into the mundane.
Okay, let's brainstorm what that actually looks like on the page. Because if I'm the author, I don't want to lose the magazine example.
No, you shouldn't.
Right, it's unique and memorable, so how do I actually weave it in?
Here is a concrete way you could restructure that. When moving from extreme forms of Tashbih to the topic of humor, explicitly frame the act of smiling and the very existence of the Kaf Kaf magazine as a perfect example of balanced Tashbih.
Oh, that is interesting. So you explain why it connects, like on a fundamental level?
Precisely. One possible approach is to explain that experiencing humor and joy is a way for humans to reflect a divine attribute within our limitations.
Right, like reflecting mercy or joy, but in a human capacity.
Yes. And then you contrast this directly with the extreme Tanzih of the Inquisition, which viewed God as so distant that laughter was deemed a sin.
Because if God is entirely unreachable, then anything grounded in the human physical experience, like a laugh, becomes like an insult to that transcendence.
Exactly. By making that specific philosophical connection, the magazine isn't just a random tangent anymore.
It becomes a proof of concept.
Yes. It becomes a living, breathing proof of concept for the entire theological tightrope we've been analyzing.
That fundamentally changes the reading experience. I mean, it transforms a jarring tonal shift into a massive payoff.
It really does.
But, that struggle to maintain connective thematic tissue doesn't stop at the newsstand. I noticed the exact same structural issue later on, specifically when the author starts fielding external inquiries in the latter half of the material.
Oh, the Q&A section. Yeah, that introduces a whole new set of navigational hazards.
It really does. There is this palpable desire running through this material to be completely exhaustive. We see this vividly when an audience member asks about the Lovelake Hadith, which is this historical claim that the universe was created exclusively for the prophet.
Right.
And the author completely stops the theological discussion and dives into a highly technical, deep-in-the-weeds teardown of ancient Arab oral traditions to debunk it.
Yeah, it's quite a detour.
And right after that, they plunge into a highly complex legal breakdown of hudud specifically, the cutting of the hand, and how the prophet absolutely applied the law but used the concept of doubt, or shupa.
It is a massive influx of entirely new, highly specialized frameworks. I mean, you are suddenly dealing with legal theory and historical transmission chains.
Right. But here's my challenge for you. Given that the listener is clearly trying to answer real audience questions, isn't it necessary to provide these thorough, historical answers, even if they deviate from the main topic?
Well, the handling of the Q&A section dilutes the primary theological exploration by introducing highly complex, unrelated historical controversies without sufficient philosophical integration.
So the thoroughness is actually backfiring here.
Arab oral traditions, alongside the abrupt dive into the hudud punishments and legal doubt, function as separate mini-lectures.
They really do feel like they belong in a different class entirely.
Right. And because of that, they severely distract the audience from the core theme of conceptualizing God's attributes, or Esma.
It's like we spent all this time learning to navigate a metaphysical framework, and suddenly we're in a medieval courtroom arguing the semantics of penal law.
Yeah.
The cognitive whiplash is real.
It is. So my suggestion here is to streamline the secondary inquiries to exclusively serve as the main theme, summarizing or entirely redirecting questions that require entirely different contextual frameworks.
I love the idea of redirecting the answer to force it back into the main thesis. But how would you actually handle the Lovelake Hadith question without getting bogged down in the oral traditions of ancient Arabia?
Well, as a concrete example, instead of a lengthy historical critique of the Arab oral tradition to debunk the Lovelake Hadith, quickly tie its invalidity back to the central theme of Tanzih.
Okay, walk me through the mechanics of that.
A great way to do this is to simply explain that making God's creation of the universe dependent on any human fundamentally violates the absolute independence of God.
Oh, wow, right.
Yeah, an independence that was already beautifully established in the earlier Nefi Vizbat discussion. You don't need to debate the transmission chain. You just point out that the theological math doesn't add up based on the rules you've already established.
That is incredibly sharp. It solves multiple problems at once. I mean, you validate the audience's question by answering it, you avoid the historical tangent entirely, and you actually reinforce your master thesis about God's absolute independence.
Exactly. It keeps the audience anchored. You never want to invite your reader into a beautifully constructed house only to drag them out into the shed to show them how the plumbing works.
Right. And I think this tendency to over-deliver historical information isn't just an issue in the Q&A. It actually impacts the pacing of the core theological arguments themselves.
You're referring to the density of the historical references throughout the main text?
Yes. Let's look at the section where the author is illustrating the dangers of extreme tashbih, specifically the concept of incarnation, or hulul, where people start believing God physically entered a human body.
Right.
The text just launches into this rapid-fire listing of historical examples to prove the point. It mentions Druzism, Nusayrism, the mystic Halaj, the Baha'i faith, the Qadiani movement, and even the Buddhist concept of Krishna.
It is a sweeping, breathless tour across centuries of global religious history.
Packed into just a few paragraphs?
Yeah.
It is overwhelming. And what's fascinating is that the author actually realizes it. They pause right in the middle of this section and admit to the audience that their, quote, vessel is full. They explicitly acknowledge that they've overloaded the listener's capacity. So how can the author balance their clear desire to be historically thorough with the audience's cognitive limits?
Well, the sheer density of historical examples delivered sequentially creates cognitive fatigue, preventing the audience from fully absorbing the most profound metaphysical insights.
Because the brain is just working too hard to file away the trivia.
Exactly. The weakness here is that piling on rapid explanations of multiple disparate religious sects and historical figures across centuries turns a deeply philosophical point into a rushed, overwhelming history lesson.
Right, it's just data point after data point.
Because the listener is bombarded with data points from 19th century Qadianism to ancient Buddhism to Halaj, the emotional and spiritual weight of the theological argument is completely lost in the mental clutter.
It's like trying to appreciate the emotional depth of a fine painting while someone is standing next to you, loudly reciting the biography of every artist who ever used the color blue.
That is a perfect way to put it. When everything is highlighted, nothing is highlighted.
Right.
So my suggestion for this section is to prune the historical examples to just one or two potent, universally understandable cases, allowing the philosophical implications the necessary space to breathe.
So instead of giving the reader a sweeping catalog, you give them a microscope.
Yes.
What does that look like in practice? Give me a concrete way to prune this section.
For a concrete example, remove the exhaustive list of sects entirely. Just cut Druzism, Nusayrism, Qadianism, all of it.
Okay.
Instead, focus deeply on just the contrast between the unreachable Yahweh tradition, which brilliantly illustrates extreme Tanzih, and one clear example of human incarnate concepts like Krishna, which illustrates extreme Tashbih.
And by cutting the other 5 or 6 historical examples, you win back incredibly valuable real estate on the page.
Exactly. Then use the saved time to pause and reiterate how the linguistic structure of Qul huwallahu ahad brilliantly holds the tension between these two poles.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Right? Giving the audience time to marvel at the concept rather than rushing to memorize historical names.
I love that. You trade breadth for depth. It creates a much more profound experience for the reader when they are allowed to sit with the magnitude of Qul huwallahu ahad and really internalize how it acts as a stabilizing force between those extremes.
It honors the reader's time and, more importantly, their cognitive limits.
Absolutely. Well, let's briefly recap the core feedback we've covered today. The submitted material is highly intellectual and fascinating, but it can significantly elevate its impact with the few targeted edits. First, explicitly tie modern examples, like the humor magazine, to the core theological thesis. Weave the metaphysical into the mundane so the transitions feel logical.
Right.
Second, use the Q&A to reinforce the main theme rather than launching into entirely new historical lectures. Reframe tangential questions through the lens of Tanzih and Tashbih.
Keep the focus tight.
Exactly. And finally, prune the excessive historical lists down to 1 or 2 powerful contrasts to improve pacing and reduce cognitive load.
Yeah, give those profound insights the breathing room they need.
Totally. We highly invite the listener to apply these structural and pacing edits.
creating those thematic bridges and reducing example bloat, and then submit the revised material back to us for another critique.
I would be thrilled to read the next iteration of this piece. The foundational ideas are just undeniably strong.
Getting feedback is the best way to improve one's work, because when you are asking your audience to follow you up into the most abstract, demanding theological concepts imaginable, the very least you can do is make sure the path is clear.
Welcome to the debate. When you watch a master sculptor at work carving a figure out of just this massive block of raw marble, the entire process is fundamentally, well, it's an act of destruction.
Right.
They aren't building a shape, exactly. They are rigorously, relentlessly chipping away everything that isn't the shape. The art is in the subtraction. You find the truth by removing the excess.
I mean, I see the appeal of that, but it feels incredibly limiting. If you are only subtracting, you eventually run out of stone.
True. That is why I look at the painter. A painter starts with a blank canvas, and their process is entirely additive. Every single brushstroke is an affirmation, a declaration of what is there. You are bringing a reality into existence by adding color, depth, and presence. And that exact tension between the chisel and the brush brings us to our focus today. We are diving into a profoundly complex theological framework from our source material, one that grapples with how the human mind can even begin to comprehend the divine.
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
It is. The text explores two fundamental, totally opposing methods for understanding God. On one side, we have the concepts of nephi and Tanzih, which translates roughly to negation and absolute transcendence. And on the other side, we have ispat and tashbih, so affirmation and immanence.
It really is the ultimate philosophical divide. I mean, the core question the material poses is how a believer actually anchors their faith. Where do you start? And, what sustains you?
Precisely the question we are exploring today. Does the source material argue that the foundation of true theological understanding relies primarily on rigorous negation, basically stripping away human limitations and concepts to protect God's absolute transcendence, or does it rely primarily on active affirmation, demonstrating God's constant, intimate intervention in human affairs? I will be arguing that the source material posits negation, or Tanzih, as the indispensable anchor of faith.
Okay.
Because the human mind's greatest flaw is its constant gravitational pull toward reducing the divine to human terms, and the text insists we must fiercely guard against that through subtraction.
And I will be taking the side of the painter. I am arguing that the material prioritizes affirmation, or ispat. The text emphasizes that God's attributes exist not to prove a distant, unapproachable transcendence, but to establish an active daily intervention in the human world. A perfectly transcendent God who never touches the canvas is, well, a functionally irrelevant God.
Let's lay out our foundational positions then. From my reading, the text places negation at the very beginning of belief. It is the absolute prerequisite. Just look at the foundational creed of Islam, La ilaha illallah.
Right, there is no God but God.
Exactly. And the phrasing there is not an accident. It explicitly requires the believer to say no, la, before they are even allowed to say except, illah. You literally cannot establish the truth until you have demolished the false. The sculptor has to clear the room before the statue can even be seen.
It's a striking linguistic structure, certainly. But, clearing the room is just prep work.
It is much more than prep work. It is a hard epistemological boundary. The text makes a crucial assertion regarding how we process information, which is that questions about God must always flow from the creation to the creator, never the reverse. If you start with human concepts, human emotions, human physics, and try to project them upward onto God, you inevitably limit the divine. That is why the text relies so heavily on the principle of absolute negation, quoting the verse, "Nothing is like him. Laissez kamisli shay."
But just to be clear for the audience, that verse isn't simply about physical resemblance, right? I mean, the Arabic word misl goes much deeper than just God doesn't look like us.
Exactly. It means God shares no internal similarity, no external similarity, no conceptual similarity with anything in existence. Because our human language is hopelessly bound by physical reality, true belief can only be defined by rigorously understanding what God is not.
Right.
If a concept or picture comes into your mind, the text states explicitly, whatever that is, it is not God. You have to chip it away.
I understand the necessity of clearing the conceptual ground, but, well, while negation clears the path, affirmation is the actual destination. The source material is remarkably clear that the Quran doesn't even waste its time trying to prove God's existence from scratch.
Oh.
Yeah, it actually considers absolute atheism to be logically impossible.
Logically impossible. That's a massive claim. Walk me through the mechanism of that.
So, the text argues that the human mind is fundamentally hardwired for cause and effect. It points out the sheer absurdity of acknowledging that a tailor is required to make a shirt, a carpenter is required to hang a door, or an engineer is required for a building. But then looking at the complex cosmos, galaxies spinning in a perfectly balanced vacuum for billions of years, and suggesting there's no builder.
Okay, the design argument.
Yes. To the text, absolute atheism is an oxymoron. It's a tautology to say the creator of the system does not exist while you are standing inside the perfectly functioning system. Therefore, the text's true goal isn't proving existence. It assumes you already know the shirt has a tailor. Its goal is proving presence.
But presence without strict boundaries quickly degrades into anthropomorphism. The moment you say God is present, human beings start imagining a giant man in the sky.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. The text uses the divine names, the Esma, specifically to prove God's active involvement in life without turning him into a human. It relies heavily on the verse, he is upon some task every day. Kule yavnin huve fishan.
Right.
This is not a distant, abstract, unmoved mover sitting outside of time and space, just ignoring us. This is an active, current, deeply involved agent. If you over-index on the chisel, on transcendence, like you were suggesting, you chip away so much of the marble that there's nothing left to relate to. You end up with an empty pedestal.
I think you are misunderstanding the purpose of the chisel. Let's dig into the text's use of language, because it actually supports my point about boundaries. The text builds a highly structured argument around linguistic limitations, specifically regarding sensory metaphors.
Okay.
It points out that Islamic theology readily accepts the idea that God sees and hears, but it strictly rejects any notion that God smells or tastes.
Wait, pause there. How does accepting hearing but rejecting smelling prove anything about absolute transcendence? Aren't they both just biological senses?
That is the brilliant distinction the text makes. Hearing and seeing in a purely philosophical sense do not strictly demand a physical organ to be conceptualized.
I mean, we use ears and eyes.
We do, yes, but you can comprehend seeing as the ultimate processing of all visual data, and hearing as the absolute comprehension of all frequencies. They are forms of ultimate knowledge, but smelling and tasting, the text argues those inherently require physical, chemical reactions. They require a nose to inhale physical particles, a tongue to dissolve matter in saliva, and more importantly, tasting requires eating to sustain a physical body, which implies a biological deficiency.
So tasting implies hunger, and hunger implies weakness.
Exactly. The text is fiercely guarding against this kind of physical reduction. It rejects tasting and smelling because it refuses to allow the human mind to drag God down into the realm of biological need. The chisel comes out to strictly remove any concept that implies deficiency. This proves that transcendence, guarding the absolute, unbridgeable distinctiveness of God, is the governing rule of the theology.
I come at it from a different way. You are focusing heavily on the verbs the text meticulously rejects to keep God safe and sterile. But look at the visceral, active verbs the text actually embraces. The material brings up Surah Al-Anfal, specifically the 17th verse.
Remind me of the exact phrasing.
It's a deeply intertwined metaphor that translates roughly to, when you threw, you did not throw, but Allah threw.
Ah, yes. That is the verse addressing the prophet directly on the battlefield at Badr.
Yes. The text describes a person throwing a handful of dust or shooting an arrow, and that physical projectile finds its target against impossible odds. Now, if avoiding physical comparison and maintaining an absolute sterile transcendence were the ultimate priority of this material, it would never ever use such grounded physical language.
Well, it is metaphorical.
But it literally places God's action directly behind the physical throwing of a weapon. It is saying to the believer, your successes, your physical actions, the literal arrow finding the mark, that is direct divine intervention. You are merely the instrument, but God is the active agent in the dust and the dirt of the battlefield.
It's an intense image, sure.
It is radical affirmation. It pulls God right down into human reality. The painter is putting a massive, undeniable stroke of color right in the middle of human history.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Pulling God down into the dust is exactly what the text warns against when it shifts to discussing human psychology. The text explicitly outlines the historical catastrophes that occur when humans prioritize affirmation, when they try too hard to make God physically present and relatable.
Are you referring to the sections on incarnation theology?
Yes, exactly. The text meticulously outlines what happens when the brushstrokes of affirmation get out of control. It lists deviations like Druzism, Nusairism, and the mystic Hallaj declaring, I am the truth. But the most striking example it unpacks is Baha'u'llah in the 19th century.
Oh, right. The text has a very visceral description of Baha'u'llah's supposed revelation.
It is terrifyingly practical. It describes him walking out into the Iranian desert, standing in 60 degrees Celsius heat until, as the text bluntly puts it, his brain watered.
Wow.
Yeah. His physical mind literally broke under the strain of the environment and his own extreme spiritual exercises. And he returned claiming that God was physically incarnated within him. The text also mentions Krishna and describes how the concept of a Buddhist achieving nirvana was eventually warped. It elevated humans to deities, leading to a culture where, quoting the material, people think they can become gods as easily as buying 2 kilos of grapes at the market.
So you're saying affirmation naturally decays into humans worshiping themselves?
That is the mechanism of Tashbih, anthropomorphism, gone mad. When humans crave an immanent, affirmed God too much, they inevitably domesticate the divine. They reduce God to a man, an animal, or an object because the human mind cannot handle the infinite. The text argues that without the iron wall of negation, constantly reminding us that God is completely other, theology collapses into the absurdity of humans worshiping a guy who got sunstroke in the desert.
That's a compelling argument. But, have you considered the psychological mechanism from the exact opposite angle? The text doesn't just critique extreme eminence. It spends significant time critiquing the human desire for an absent God.
An absent God?
Yeah. It breaks down the Ayatul Kursi, the famous verse of the throne, which famously states that God neither slumbers nor sleeps.
Right. A verse typically recited to affirm God's majesty and distance from biological limits.
Yes. But look at the psychological analysis the text provides for why human beings need to be reminded of this daily. It argues that secretly, fundamentally, human beings want a God who slumbers.
Because if God slumbers, he isn't watching.
Exactly. We desperately want a transcendent, distant God who takes a nap so our own mistakes go entirely unnoticed. Think about the mechanism of human guilt. We want God to be wide awake when other people wrong us, right? We want perfect justice then. But for our own flaws, we prefer divine amnesia. Well, we want the sculptor to chip away so much of God's presence that we are left completely alone in the dark to do whatever we want.
That is a very cynical view of human nature.
But it's the text's view. The text argues that affirming a God who is constantly awake, who never forgets, is the only mechanism that prevents a descent into moral chaos. If God is just an abstract, transcendent force that doesn't actively monitor the world, if he's just an equation, the cosmos turns into a moral vacuum. Continuous, inescapable affirmation of God's watchful presence is what keeps our daily morality grounded in reality. The painting needs that ever-present watcher.
I'm genuinely not convinced by that line of reasoning
Because if you look at how this desire for an emotionally present, highly affirmed God actually plays out in practical theology, it corrupts the very text it tries to uphold.
Corrupts the text? How so?
The material clearly demonstrates how this craving for immanence leads directly to the fabrication of Scripture. The text discusses the ancient Arab oral tradition, which was, highly susceptible to creating comforting narratives. It targets two very famous, widely circulated phrases that millions of people genuinely believe are authentic hadiths, sayings of the Prophet.
You are talking about the hidden treasure narrative.
Yes, the phrase, "I was a hidden treasure and I wished to be known, so I created the universes." And the other one, the Lovelake hadith, "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have created the universes." The text is utterly ruthless here. It states categorically that from a technical, scholarly perspective, these have absolutely no basis in authentic prophetic sources.
Well, it attributes them to the mystic Ibn Arabi as metaphysical poetry, not literal history.
Exactly. But why did the masses adopt them so eerily? Why did they force them into the realm of holy texts? Because those fabrications perfectly satisfy the human craving for an emotionally relatable God. We want a God who feels lonely, who wants to be discovered like a hidden treasure.
Right.
We want a God who creates the entire cosmos just because he favors one specific human being. Because if God has emotional needs and favorites, then human beings are deeply important to him.
It makes the universe feel less cold.
It does. But the text argues that this is just humans projecting their own emotional insecurities onto the Creator. It fundamentally compromises God's absolute independence. It paints over the truth with comforting lies. Strict, rational negation, taking the chisel and ruthlessly smashing those fabricated comforts, is the only tool that can purge these false additions from the faith.
You are focusing entirely on the text's rejection of fabricated manuscripts. But let's look at how theology bleeds into how a culture actually lives and breathes. Let's talk about the text's fascinating contrast regarding human emotion, specifically the mechanism of laughter.
Laughter as a theological metric?
Absolutely. And it perfectly illustrates the danger of your absolute negation. The text draws a brilliant historical contrast. It points out that the Christian Alexandrian Church, which was heavily influenced by Aristotle's philosophical treatises, actually banned laughter. They viewed it as a sin.
Wait, how does Aristotelian philosophy logically result in banning a smile? What is the bridge there?
It is the ultimate logical conclusion of extreme transcendence. Aristotle posited the unmoved mover, right? A perfectly static, utterly transcendent entity. The logic goes like this. If God is perfect, he cannot change because any change would be a move away from perfection.
Sure.
Emotion is a state of change. Therefore, God has no emotion. Therefore, to emulate God and be holy, humans must be entirely stoic. Laughter is a loss of control. It is a physical, emotional spasm. Hence, laughter is a defect, and constant sorrow and austere weeping are the only true signs of piety.
That is a very heavy, detached approach to spirituality.
It's sterile, but look at the Islamic tradition the text contrasts this with. It notes that the Quran explicitly attributes both laughing and weeping to God's creation, and it brings up the prophetic tradition that a simple smile directed at another human being is considered sadaqah, an act of charity.
Meaning, a facial expression has actual measurable spiritual weight in this framework.
Yes. The text argues that a smile is literally recorded in your spiritual ledger as if you had handed gold to the poor. The source material laments that modern people have forgotten how to smile because their religious worldviews have become so rigidly intellectual.
I see.
The text is passionately arguing for an affirmative, emotionally present theology. A theology of strict negation gives you the Alexandrian Church, austere, joyless, fundamentally disconnected from human joy. A theology of affirmation gives you a worldview where a simple human smile reflects the divine light and counts as an act of worship. The painter is using the brightest colors available.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. I hear the beauty in that, I truly do. But as we synthesize the source material's overarching message, I have to return to the anchor. Without the rigorous boundary of negation, without constantly, forcefully reminding ourselves that our highest concepts, our noblest emotions, and our most beautiful metaphors all fall infinitely short of God, faith inevitably devolves.
even with the risk of being too austere?
Yes, because we've seen it in the text's historical examples. Without the chisel of negation, we slip into human-centric idolatry. We embrace the madness of Baha'u'llah's sunstroke, and we start treating fabricated poetry about a lonely God as divine truth. We must start with the law, the no, to protect the integrity of the divine from our own egos.
And yet, as I summarize my reading of the text, I maintain that without the active affirmation of God's daily, intimate involvement, belief becomes nothing more than an empty, abstract philosophical equation.
Right.
A perfectly transcendent God who does not interact with the world, who does not guide the archer's arrow, who does not care enough to record a human smile, is functionally no different from a God who is asleep. Affirmation isn't just color on a canvas, it is the lifeblood of actual practice.
It seems we are looking at two sides of a profoundly necessary coin. And to the text's immense credit, it actually acknowledges this exact tension. It uses a brilliant musical metaphor, describing this philosophical struggle between transcendence and immanence as the accord of the soul, like tuning the strings of an instrument.
Yes, the text argues the human soul has to be stretched tightly between these two extreme poles to produce the right sound. You have to constantly oscillate. You have to know that God is entirely beyond your physical comprehension, while simultaneously knowing that God is intimately involved in your every breath. It is an exhausting, lifelong tension, but, well, a necessary one.
It truly is. The depth of the linguistic and theological analysis in this source material is remarkable. It leaves us with so much more to uncover regarding how language simultaneously limits and expands our understanding of ultimate truth.
It forces us to realize that every time we speak about the divine, we are walking a razor-thin tightrope between elevating our own minds and reducing the universe.
Which brings us right back to where we started. Whether you are the sculptor, rigorously chipping away the marble of false assumptions and biological limitations, or you are the painter, carefully applying the vibrant colors of divine presence and action, the masterpiece is never truly finished. The tension remains, and the work of understanding continues. Thank you for listening.